For more now on what this election means to Egypt, we're joined live by Ambassador Kurt Volker. He's the executive director at the McCain Institute for International Leadership at the University of Arizona. He also served as the U.S. ambassador to NATO. Thank you, sir, for joining us today.
My pleasure to be here. Thank you.
So let's talk about voter turnout. How key is the scale of turnout in Egypt?
Well, it's important to the government that they want to demonstrate that there was a broad participation by Egyptian society in what they view will be a validation of al-Sisi as the new Egyptian president. If it's a small turnout, that diminishes the appearance of legitimacy. A big turnout they can use to then claim great legitimacy for this newly elected leader.
So if the voter turnout is low once again, can they extend it yet another day?
I think there's a limit in terms of appearances. How often can you do this? I mean, what starts to make it look silly? But I think 3 days, in a country the size of Egypt and with the difficulty of voting that people might experience, you can justify that. You could justify another day, but there's going to be a natural limit.
So here's my question to you. I read that people who are not voting might actually be fined if they don't vote. So my question to you is that really a democratic thing to do on a country that wants to be on a path to democracy, to fine people who are not going to go to the polls?
Right. No, the whole thing is not democratic. Let's not kid ourselves. So the idea of an election where you ban the most popular opposition party, even if they're extremist Islamists and we have differences of view, that's not going to be a wholly democratic election. The idea that you do this without the growth of other political parties that might represent differences of view, that's also something. The idea that you do this with a military-controlled transitional government where the head of the military is then the main candidate, that's also not a terribly democratic process. So finding people along the way, it's just part of the use of the instruments of democracy to create a veneer of a democratic outcome when it's really very far from it is what we're really seeing in Egypt.
So let's talk about al-Sisi. Clearly, he led the military that ousted Morsi, and we know he can run the military. I was asking another expert the other day, we know he can run the military, but can he create jobs? Can he fix the social issues in the country? Can he bring stability?
Well, let's take the optimistic point of view for a second. Egypt does need stability. They've gone through a couple of years in the country. Some stability with a competent government would be a good thing. But then you're never going to solve the problems in Egypt in the long run unless you can create a more inclusive and open society. One where people of different points of view, some who might support the military, some who might be more Islamist, can all have their voices heard and do so by abiding by the same democratic rules, which is where Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood screwed up before, is that they wanted to accumulate power just for themselves and to dictate to the rest of the country. That's not going to work, but neither is a strictly military-run government going to work either. They've got to create a more inclusive way of governing.
Let's talk about Muslim Brotherhood. They've been banned. A lot of the activists are out of the country. How much support do you think they still have inside Egypt?
Well, unfortunately, their support is probably growing because what happens when the government bans a party and persecutes them, they sentence hundreds of people to mass execution in one court judgment. That's going to incentivize people to want to support and sympathize with the Muslim Brotherhood. So that support is probably growing. If it had been at 20 to 30%, it's probably somewhere above that now. It's not a majority. I don't think they could win an election outright again, as they did with Morsi. I think that people are fed up with the chaos in Egypt. But you can't also deny that this is a factor in politics. And when you demonize a group like this, they become the only group that people can turn to for an alternative. And that's fundamentally not in the military's interest. They ought to have democratic civil society groups that represent different ways or different ideas of governing in a democratic process rather than driving people towards an Islamist agenda.
Do you foresee the kinds of protests we saw last summer after Morsi was ousted?
No, I don't think so. I think that you're going to see a well-executed election, a military leader rising to power, well-executed demonstrations in support, persecution of the Muslim Brotherhood, and that's going to buy some gain in the short term. But the problem is what happens after that.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Volker. Thank you for being with us today.